Hello everyone, today we talk about Ottoman warfare. A crazy enterprise because this should be an omni-comprehensive reflection on, in fact, the Ottoman military and warfare during the 16th and the 17th centuries. As you know, I created a playlist specifically about Ottoman warfare because we discussed the Ottoman army multiple occasions, also in earlier times than this during the Middle Ages. Today we start discussing mostly from the time of Selim I, so also the proper creation of what will remain, also from a geographical point of view, orientatively speaking, the Ottoman Empire as we know it up to the 20th century. As you know, if you remember the other videos, or if you don't, it's the same. Today we'll cover the thing again partly. We have concentrated on specific aspects of Ottoman warfare that are still debated today, not much for a strictly military historical point of view, but also for political reasons and anti reasons that arrive to this day. So Ottoman history is a big thing, right? And more than that, in a Western sense, if there is something that we narrowly define as Western Europe in modern terms, that is also, if you think about it, a split within our conception of the European continent. This is due to properly the Ottomans and the clash between them and their enemies in the continent. The question is therefore crucial because these protagonists are fundamentally what have become the Western Europeans and some of the most powerful countries eventually in the world in the following centuries. Not all of them were enemies with the empire, and there should add a certain perspective on this, such as the fact that powers like mainly the Protestant ones, like the English, the Dutch, actually supported the Ottoman Empire against Catholic Europe, were in fact those countries that we're talking about that rocketed in the following centuries. Countries like the Netherlands, the UK are some of the very few countries in the world you can actually say these are rich countries, right? There are very few in Europe, and they're definitely not even the largest, or not even the most important ones, technically speaking. It's not France, it's not Germany. There are countries that owed their great success at a certain point. We will talk about this. Also, this capacity of cultivating their own interests and capitalizing upon them, and eventually, especially taking this maritime path. And we could add to these actually France, that would become undoubtedly, first of all, still the most powerful country in Europe, the most powerful military in Europe, and that for centuries has represented the hegemonic threat to the existence also of its neighbors, but that had been allied to the Ottoman Empire, to the Sublime Gate, in an anti-Catholic, anti-Habsburgic function, as we know. And we discussed this especially relatively to the renewed power under Louis XIV, because before that France also had its problems. There's this sinusoidal trend that France has, the 100 Years' War, the wars of religion, and the Fronde, etc. But then when France comes back, he tries to be hegemonic, and he manages to be it. Thinking about Napoleon, and even here the broader concept is to look at the clash with the Ottoman Empire and all properly the conflict that it triggered, not just because of itself fighting against other Europeans, because we will see there is fundamentally a European nature of the Ottoman Empire. It's hardly deniable, at least as far as its center of power was concerned, and also were probably the most important strategic theater was concerned since the time of Suleiman I, and the creation, let's say, of a proper European dimension, like an overwhelming intrusion, we could say, in European history that up to that point had not taken place, because the Byzantine Empire as a universe on its own had gradually enclosed within itself, and there is also no doubt at all of the fact that the Ottoman Empire is de facto a continuation of the Roman Empire, and this has absolutely nothing to do with what you personally think. This is what the Ottomans thought, as they were emperors of Rome, and together with that, they also held, just like the Byzantine emperors, all those rights over the Holy Roman Empire never being recognized, and so on. So there is a universal dimension here that it's properly the thing that we often lack or miss in the equation, because naturally what happened, especially during the 17th, the 18th century, but broadly speaking, this crucial moment that goes of European history and world history, actually, from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, has shaped our way of defining the other, of defining and telling this great story of conflict, but also of cooperation and of war, of struggle, but also, as always, as war brings, of hybrid, of influence, of intersections, that at this point in our own history cannot be denied. This has nothing to do with whether you like or not, what happened in the past, whether you like or not what is still happening today, because nobody can claim that things like the Balkan question is truly over. Nobody can look at even modern Turkey and simply say, everything is fine with the relation of Europe with this country, with the power that it represents, with the general international action that the West still carries out, very, very feebly, unfortunately, at this point, but still, importantly enough, at least as far as NATO is concerned, is, huge animal that still moves very cautiously and, however, still works and still is indeed the greatest military power in the world. And there is really nobody there to challenge it, but there are definitely different ideas of what the future should be about, and this is what we should be concerned also about. To make it a long story short, we have addressed in the previous videos certain ideas that I'm still modifying or perfecting over time. The first one is specifically the very important westernness of the Ottoman Empire in itself, right? It's obvious that, as we were saying before, from a narrow, not even Eurocentric, but specifically Western Eurocentric perspective, that, I repeat it, historiographically, culturally, derives exactly from the Ottoman Wars. The Ottomans are something else. Doesn't matter that the Balkans, part of Central Europe, where Christians fought alongside the Ottomans, and sometimes willingly, right? I think we were remembering the Hungarians at the time, but just look at even the German Protestants, as we were also referring to before. I mean, there are lots of different specific polities that acted not even just ambiguously, but specifically pro-Ottoman policy in Europe against, once again, Catholic Europe. But just also without them, consider all the enormous amount of refugees, turncoats, simple emigres, in many ways, that literally went from Europe to live in the Ottoman Empire, to serve in the Ottoman military, to work as advisors, as pirates, as literally as merchants. We have an overwhelming evidence that every person that is acquainted, at least elementarily, to Renaissance historiography knows how much is being written on and how overwhelmingly documented this reality is. We could make later also some very meaningful examples. And the point I'm making here is, first of all, just reconsider what you think the Ottoman Empire was, if you think essentially just as an enemy of the idea of Europe that you have today, because that idea didn't exist at the time, nor for the Ottomans, nor for the rest of the Europeans. And also, we are talking in these times. We have seen it, especially in the series about on Prince Eugen, that it's mostly the universalistic and Christian, or Muslim in this case, ecumenic dream that dominates the political and military, could say, theory and practice, letting alone the fact that, of course, there were another perspectives that looked at a more local interests, as we've seen, that were growing truly modern and secularized in that sense. So I can't trick you into making you believe that there was just a universalistic idea, that there was no sense of of local identity, but it's exactly that sense of local identity that said screw up to Christianity, to Europeanness. If we have to make money by backing the Ottomans, we will do that, right? So that's the history you have to choose, or one or the other, right? There is no way. And generally speaking, from an ideological point of view, taking this stance when we look at history, it's not very wise in the first place. The Westerners, the Westernness, truly, of the Ottoman Empire, it's a topic that I promise we will analyze more carefully in the future. Today we'll say things that I will individually discuss also in depth at a point, mostly about the alleged technological gap between the West and the Ottoman Empire during these centuries, which I tell you immediately, it's a myth. There is no proof of any kind of this, but that military historians like Parker, for example, that everybody quotes, but every person that is acquainted to the most updated historiography knows that, in spite of the enormous and fantastic work for whom we are all very thankful to Parker, he expressed very debatable ideas, to say the least. So great documents, great information, but still on the historical judgment, the interpretation of sources, especially relatively to the technological thing, but not only, and the general modernistic idea of a great divide between the modern age per se and whatever existed before, it's now fundamentally debunked, and that has to do mostly with another aspect, the Western, obsession that I try to I presume most of you are actually immune from it, even as Westerners, but that I fight constantly on, because I see it constantly reiterated here and there, which is the technologistic idea that, warfare is won because of technology. Now, I will not repeat myself, otherwise you will simply, quit Schwerpunkt forever. Every time I say this thing about how it's all about doctrine, without which technology is basically worth zero, literally meant. But it has specifically to do with the idea of the rise of Europe, right? And in these centuries, that naturally is to be understood in many different ways, including the fact, as we were saying before, that the Atlantic route, that the import of immense resources throughout colonialism allowed the Europeans to elaborate new, to improve, fundamentally to seek specific technologies to solve problems that they had, such as, that's how the steam engine is not being invented, because that existed since the ancient world, but that was implemented and applied on a field that allowed the implementation of those specific technologies. So the only reason why those technologies are, it's not because somebody invented the technology at the time, but because finally there were the political, social conditions to put that to use. And that we mostly see as, the West emerged at that point because of technology. Technological gap, I'm not saying it's not important, but specifically, I was taking off towards the 18th century to make comparisons, like, what was the strongest country in the world at the time? It was China, right? Throughout all the 18th century, at least up to the 7 Years' War, there's no doubt of any sort that the most powerful power in the world was King China, and the point here is that, however, the Ottoman, let's say, setbacks that, as you know, we also study in the Prince Eugen. We will study at least in the hopefully in the Prince Eugen series between the end of the 17th, starting from the failed siege at Vienna and ending, with the further campaigns of the Habsburgs during the 18th century, the loss of Hungary, and the important areas up to the Danube and so on. It's been explained historically speaking out, at that time the Ottomans were simply lagging behind Western Europe technologically speaking, right? Or that in the meanwhile, especially, this gap had been created. As we will see, this is actually not true. The westernness of the Ottoman Empire is to be measured exactly through this actually early acquaintance to, first of all, to properly Western warfare. I mean, the idea that the Ottomans were essentially the northwesternmost Muslim power that existed at the time, were just right in front of Constantinople, across the Marmara Sea. And they were specifically settled in an area that had been Western for millennia at that point. The thing is very important, because those are not differences that you can eliminate, or you can't think naturally of the rising Ottomans of the 14th and 15th, but not even of the 13th century back in the day. At the end of the 13th century, that's where the Osmanians fundamentally created this first nucleus, as Turks, wherever you got used to portray them like in this kind of exoticistic view that in the West we have created mostly during from the 8th and from the 19th century, rather than actually during the same Ottoman wars, at least the highest sense of the Ottoman wars. These naturally were not the nomadic Turks from Central Asia. At that point they had basically nothing to do with them anymore. Secondly, they weren't even whatever you think the east of this kind of weird eastern stuff, this the browns, or the camels, or the palms, the exotism. There is something very soundly, properly European in there, right? We talk about Asia Minor, we're talking about an area that not only had been importantly Western for millennia, as we've seen, but that also in the last centuries, especially after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire during the Fourth Crusade, had been settled by an enormous amount of peoples coming from, for example, I don't know, think about all the Akritae of the Palaiologoi in Western Asia Minor, Western Anatolia. These were all people from Western Europe specifically. They were all Western feudal culture. Think about, I don't know, even the Catalan Company and so on. For not talking about all the masses of slaves present in the same Islamic principalities of Anatolia, pouring from places that were largely, I don't know, Russia, this Slavic, the Caucasus, and this is something we have observed actually much better for the Mamluks, that were at that point the real power there, like after the collapse of Egypt had always been actually a very important center of power ever since the Byzantines lost it back in the 7th century. But that was a very different power, for example, from the heavily Persianized Caliphate of Baghdad, and this broader also, in fact, nomadic influenced reality, of which the Ottomans would also importantly be like the Mamluks, but also the Ayyubids before the Fatimids were, even if you look at Crusader warfare, we talked about it often, much more similar, for example, to the Westerners in terms of actual military culture, organization, what armies looked like. I mean, the early Turks were literally nomads from the steppes, and they fought in a very different way from the Egyptians. Though even Egypt, how many years did it stay under Roman rule? 700. Right, so these are not, once again, things that you change. Yeah, you can give that, the local cultures, the local traditions were millenary in millenary age, they never were substituted. But the Western impact there is to be regarded equally, and that it didn't even begin, as you know, for Egypt with Rome, but actually with 300 years before with Alexander. Plus all the other permeabilities. I mean, how many Greek mercenaries you could find in Egypt? I don't know, by the 6th, by the 4th century BC. This is another interesting take, actually. I mean, even recognizing the fact that broad areas of the Mashrek have an overwhelming amount of culture in common with the West, right? All these fundamentally Indo-Europeans pouring down. I mean, if you look at Persia, we're talking about an Iranian, an Indo-European power, right? Of course, it was something different. Of course, it changed over time. But think about the Kurds. Think about Armenia. Think about this world of steppes is literally next door. Also, the Slavic world, as we have remembered it in the steppes, as it had arrived there, or in the Balkans. And it's not just the Western influence that actually, in my opinion, had such a dramatic importance in the development of Ottoman warfare. Naturally, that's the most evident to me. That's the one that, aside from the obvious models that were perpetuated traditionally speaking, within the tradition of the Khans, because that's essentially what the Turks were up to, mentally speaking. But these guys conquered Constantinople, and they essentially start ruling it from the same exact standpoint of the former Roman Empire. Right? Those are the lands, and especially after the Battle of Calderan, where they conquered Mesopotamia, and the invasion of Egypt, you have basically what back in the day had been the Eastern Roman Empire at its highest extent, right? If not even beyond, because they stretched even up to Arabia, they reached as far as Sudan, right? There was even in there important reinjection of other models into Ottoman culture. But it's also important to stress how in pre-industrial times, we look at such extended realities, you can't help but think that we're still essentially regional powers with their own specific culture were brought under the military of an empire that had its base, as far as literally in Europe, in Constantinople, right? And that's it, right? You can't see Constantinople indeed as something on its own. You can't even say it's just Europe. No, it's something beyond. It goes beyond. It goes the universalism. It goes towards the ecumenic role that the empire, whichever we were talking about, from the Mongol one, from the Roman one, from the Caliphate, which are all models that the Ottomans embrace altogether, right? And for them, they were exactly those people. Aside, well, the Mongols really not, but as far as the naturally first Islamic power, that's fairly obvious. Actually, they were very reverent, even towards the Khanate of the Golden Horde, even again towards the Tartars of Crimea. Let alone they even fought against them and became their vassals. But there was this idea back in the subconscious, let's say, that, of the Turkish past, that those guys of the steppes, those who were the Khagans, right, the Khans of Khans, had been the ones that had the tide that had submerged the world back in the day. Those, they remembered that and were freaking fascinated by that. But when we look from the west, of course, the Ottomans looked something different. But if you look them from the east, from a standpoint especially of Persia, you have the impression that the Ottomans are nothing but a Western power. If you look even just the Battle of Calderan, you see there what triggered eventually Persian warfare, this victory obtained by this very important firepower of the Janissaries, of Ottoman artillery, against this Persian model was still, if you want, lost in the Middle Ages, in its feudalism, in its specific Iranian tradition and identity that were surely much stronger than anything that the Ottomans were, because you can't properly say that was something, like a Turkish culture that became so totalizing in that reality as as the Persian influence could be, as the Roman influences could be, there was definitely a formality of it, but there is more than that. There is an implementation, even an exaggeration, and something psychological about the Ottoman Empire that is quite fascinating and disturbing at the same time, because it's utterly terrifying, and that's something that I like to remember about the Ottomans, because it's not just about saying, Mom, the Turks are arriving, because actually in the Eastern Mediterranean it was said the same thing. Mom, the Christians are arriving, right? In the Mediterranean it was fought in burning ways, and actually the only thing you can criticize this dialectic is saying, as we'll see now, that you couldn't even tell was plenty of Christians in Ottoman armies and navies, and plenty of even of Muslims actually. Even from the other side, were lots of Muslim powers that were actually allied with the Christians against the Ottomans. Obviously enough, we've seen it, for example, in the video we made about the expedition to Tunis. That's also another important scenario. But the point I was making is that the Ottomans were really investing, in my opinion, an enormous asset in deterrent power. I mean, they really intended to scare the hell out of any other living being that existed in the surroundings. They were objectively, yes, in the formality of the political culture, were more ferocious. There was something about the unity of their power. That is something that also Machiavelli famously describes. I mean, Machiavelli was rightfully depicting France and the Turk, as he called him, as the greatest powers of the time, and naturally also, if you want some opposites. I mean, the idea that France was altogether easy to attack, but not to invade even, but not to maintain, because you could crush the royal army, but there would be plenty of noblemen that would be all small kings on their own, fundamentally. Think about the Bourbon, famously enough. They even rebelled to Francis I. It had a state within the state. But you couldn't. This thing would have kept rebelling, so it would have been very hard to subdue. Whereas for the Turk, even here with some optimism, but objectively, he was seeing right through it. I mean, if you crushed, if you had knocked out Constantinople, let's assume, and the Sultan's army, the whole thing would have crumbled in a way. The Ottoman Empire was a true empire, right? It was a true, enormous centralized system that governed on this eventually this gradual shades of submission of this enormous area that stretched from Sudan to the Ukraine, from Germany to the Persian Gulf, and if you consider post-industrial coercive potential standards, that's an unspeakable thing. I mean, nobody in Europe could think they could, of course, extend their powers at that time, their capacities on that scale, right? Naturally, the lands that were governed by the Ottomans were very different from Europe, right? And the reason why Europe was so fragmented actually was the reason also why Europe probably developed. I mean, won in the end, we could say, but also developed, and that's what made it win at around time, in ways that the Ottomans didn't. That's exactly where we have to look at. Because as far as the Ottoman military is concerned, this decline during the 16th or the 17th century is not evident at all, right? There is no idea of this. On the contrary, if you really care about what the Westerners thought of the time, those are the very first sources that, or the only ones maybe, that state that the Ottomans were pretty damn good in their military, and superior very often also to the West. And there are certain specific aspects. For others, the Westerners actually were superior, and we'll see it in a while. But we're talking about, difference in arms and so on. But as far as the power in itself, and this is what we have to get used to think like, strategically speaking, is that there are different ways to be powerful, but, that power speaks, is homogeneous, like it speaks the same language, in a way. And the westernness of the Ottoman Empire can be observed from the development of firearms indeed. Why is this so important? Well, because we see essentially that the Ottomans were the power that by the 16th century developed, implemented artillery the most, with the greater degree of experimentalism, of resources invested, even of deployability at some point. They had fundamentally rocketed in a way that it was not so common in the other Muslim powers. Actually, if we look at the Mamluks, if you look at the Safavids, if you look at even at the Mughals, objectively, we know that it was an important, artillery culture, let's say, that was implemented. That rendered these empires have been defined as empires of gunpowder. We talk about Mughals here and there, about the Mamluks as well, not much about Persia, not even about the Tartars, that actually instead were the least opened to firearms. Actually, they deemed that they had them, but they didn't like them very much. The Ottomans are, however, the power that most evidently has the least prejudice towards them. The Ottoman historians actually write, maybe inventing it, this, by the 16th century, that this passion for firearms began back in the day, since the 14th century in the Ottoman armies, but it doesn't seem to be true. Actually, we made a video about this, and we explained how probably also the Ottomans had initially some problem with the adoption of these. Literally a cultural reaction. It was a cultural resistance to the adoption of firearms, but they couldn't resist for political as well as strategical reasons, right? Through the fact that, as we were saying before, this power evolved from a small principality fundamentally into a truly centralized state with a head that was unlike the other rulers that existed in Islam at that time. That could count overwhelmingly on these European communities, right? Not just local ones. I mean, Orban was a German and easily gave the master cannon. It was destroyed during Constantinople siege in 1453. But the deployability in there was simply like the Byzantines were offered the same thing, that couldn't even buy it. So you can't say, oh well, it was a German stuff, because actually, yes, also the Spanish. The greatest power actually out there at that point, and Portugal, the Austrians, they didn't have the great technological capabilities, and mostly bought them from the Italians, from the Germans, because these were the most technologically advanced countries there. So did the Ottomans, as a matter of fact, as Orban is an example. So people traveled in Renaissance times much more than what we are actually used to think, and so the circulation of techniques, of improvements, doesn't render possible by the 16th century any point against the fact the Ottomans were backwards. The greatest invention in the history of firearms during the period analyzed in here, that go literally from the beginning to the end, so are the granulation of power that fundamentally improves efficiency of firearms. That is, powder basically explodes much more powerfully as you let more oxygen pass through to the various grains, so that it's set on fire. It ignites more more quickly. And the bayonet, right? The addition of the substitution of after shortening of the decreasing of numbers of the pike on muskets, and we're talking here about the 1500s to 1700s. So literally the time we're looking at, granulation of powder is something that the Ottomans invented, right? And we have extensive evidence of great practice, great culture, great aptitude of the Ottomans to firearms. We see it for these monster cannons that are employed in all the major sieges during the expansion in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans. in the Mashrek, especially also if you look at the Persian frontier, it was the limit of Ottoman expansion in the east. This not just big pieces, but also this plethora of greater of smaller ones were sometimes even cast locally. That we have specific news of a centralized foundry in Adrianople. We have news of a lot of Europeans, as we were saying, but also of specific Turkish funders in here. So in a great capacity to also make them pass on terrifying grounds like the ones of Southern Europe can be. Look at the Balkans specifically, and therefore also this great logistical capacity is gained within them. At the Siege of Malta, there is great evidence of Ottoman snipers, for example, having a pretty damn effective range of something like 150 meters that rendered Christian pickets untenable. The Westerners didn't have those ranges. The Janissaries were mostly basically a firepower infantry. We'll talk about here also why, for example, the Ottomans never actually developed something, an integrated Pike-and-Shot system like the Europeans, and that was basically their sole tactical weakness, or weak point, if you prefer. The Westerner, conversely, was the one in which the Ottomans excelled, and that was the absence of a substantial amounts of good light cavalry, like the Ottomans launched in swarms, but the Europeans were best at pike and shot in the way the Ottomans couldn't. But the picture here is also fascinating because, as we were saying before, there is a problem of documentation. That is, the Ottoman Empire, just like the Byzantine Empire before in the last centuries, was not as well documented as the West. I mean, in the West we had a freaking thing called the Renaissance. We had an overwhelming per capita wealth. We had sound, good, middle classes were rising, were expanding in ways the places like the Balkans, the Near East, didn't have, historically speaking, right? This could be said also for essentially for Eastern Europe. Like, those were much far darker worlds. The countries, as we were saying, like Germany, like Italy, were the most advanced technologically in the world. A power like, think about a power like France, just resources it could put together. The dynamism that starts presenting in Northern Europe, in places like the Flanders, with the Dutch rebellion eventually at the end of the 16th century, even in England in its own way, gradually, but especially at the thought level, the Reformation had an important impact on the long run. Think about Venice. I mean, the Venetian naval power altogether, combined with the one of Genoa, was basically the largest. There was no other European power that could boast it. Spain, that manages to basically to defeat the French, to expand in important areas in Europe, including the most advanced, as we have seen, and that discovers the Americas, has this dramatic availability of precious metal. It's really something that think about all the bureaucracy of this, all the growth of the modern state, the way we stylize it, right? It was something that half of Europe from the eastern side didn't even imagine, right? They didn't have the resources, except the Ottomans, right? The Ottomans were the only ones that, in this imperial scale of power, had the possibility of maintaining a permanent army, for example. That's what the Janissaries fundamentally are, right? And the nature of the Ottoman military in this regard is also very important. Why didn't the Ottomans develop pike and shot like the Europeans? Well, looking at the Clausewitz and triads, we can see different intertwined reasons. So, from a political point of view, the Ottoman Sultan was fundamentally conceived as a great personal master, naturally wanted by God, that simply command. I mean, the function of command was much more enhanced by tradition of the steppe in these worlds, right? than it was in Europe. In Europe, there was the monarchies couldn't do anything without their councils, without the various stands, without the parliaments. Everything was, fundamentally discussed. There was a balance, an equilibrium. There was always this negotiation that it's possibly one of the single most overlooked aspects of the reasons why the West in these centuries is becoming the West, aside from all. Naturally, most of these problems this decisional problems concerned expenses for war, so the Ottomans boosted Europe dramatically in that sense as well and accelerated the problem. From a political point of view, the Sultan was the overruler, right? And its armed forces were specifically his own, were the personal ones. Janissaries were created, right, as the new militia, exactly like this. They had to be a permanent army, but fundamentally they were a servant army. So much they were detached. Aside from the Dev Sherman, that what it fundamentally was. These guys were taken as kids from the populations, mostly of the Balkans. They mostly said Albania, but actually they were actually famously also recruited from many other countries in the Balkans. As kids, they were indoctrinated fanatically into Islam. They were cut, initially at least, because the Devonshire evolved over time, contact with not just their homes, but the rest of society, of Muslim society, of the Turks. These people became a caste in many ways. These were the darkest times, let's say, of the 15th and 16th century, but already by the mid-16th century beyond, the Shirme system had, first of all, the Janissaries had reached a much greater power on their own, had been given more privileges, more freedoms, more autonomies. So much that the Devshirme in the end functioned in the sense that there were parents that tried everything possible to give their children to the Ottomans to make them become Janissaries, because when they would be adults, they would bring them lands, money, pensions, which actually happened. So the dark side of Devshirme is mostly the earlier times. Then the ways also Ottoman armies could be recruited, whatever they did, is all in another matter. But that, for example, reflects how this personal army of the Sultan, at the end of the day, became something which also the Sultan had to over-rely, because there wasn't much else outside of it properly meant. And if you look, we've made a video on the structure of the Janissaries corps. They were literally stylized as servants, right? Officials were called, I don't know, with the names of cooks, or they had this great rites symbols, this great cauldron from which they ate all together. And this privileged status of being adoptive children of the Sultan. The Sultan was their father, their master father, their godfather, right? And this is properly the Muslim concept of slavery, or better, servitude, that you can see also very clearly in the Mamluk army. In Egypt, it was very similar. The idea is the Mamluks, what were the most privileged part of the population, were actually serfs, and they had it actually good. The beginnings were harsh. But once they were settled, and they would become something very powerful on their own. So the Janissaries are, if you want, not a public corps. This is very important. It's not like, I don't know, in France, when they were experimenting, we also made a video about this, the creation of a national militia, just like the Swiss one, and it failed miserably, up to at least the mid 16th century. There was a great debate that had to do with the world parliaments, with the whole thing. The Ottomans did it. The Ottomans created this thing entirely as dynasts on their own, right? Consider all the problems, here institutionally speaking, with the empire. The fact that there was no concrete rule for succession. The next sultan, usually a sultan's death was kept secret exactly for this reason, because the first person would seat on Constantinople's throne would become sultan, and also the most favored were the provinces around the empire. This was the core. The Janissaries were the core, right? And they didn't need to be, a citizen army. They didn't need to be all equal. They needed to compete among each other. They needed to be kept satisfied, but never too much, because they could revolt in that sense. So in a way, the capacity that you can find in literally national armies, like you see in the Swiss, think about the Landsknechten or the other, armies that eventually, or the Terzi at this point actually, that they had a specific national pride, right? Because they were either, you're Swiss, you're German, you're Spanish, even if they were actually multinational, because I don't know, the Terzi had famously lots of Italians, of Germans, from all the regions of the Habsburgic power. But the idea is that the Ottomans do not give that specific spirit to their own army. They can't be pikemen. They can't all equal to each other. They can't be a single body on their own. They have to be an extension of the sultanial one. They have to be somebody that can die in the blink of an eye, not just to try to really. It doesn't matter even properly to win proper, as long as you die for the Sultan, as you are able to do whatever he will command you to do, right? Without asking, without having a civic responsibility or autonomy. You're a servant. You're not even a free man. So you can be thrown away, right? And this was not done, naturally, because the Janissaries were the elites. There were certain... as we'll see now, the rest of the Ottoman military was made up. Essentially, there was this other, let's say, semi-permanent army was connected to the Timars, that were the provinces in which the Ottoman Empire was divided in, that were all very heterogeneous, because every province fundamentally had a military tradition on its own in this huge empire. So every army was a provincial one that brought its own tactics, its own military culture, traditions. The Timar was essentially subcontracted. It's a bit like the Byzantine Pronoia. It's not a full feudalism like in Europe. You have people that maintained by band these the possession of their own alloy, their own household. No, they can be changed. They usually are maintained up to their death by the Sultan as individual governors, but they are removed, and there is a great competition in here, because also in here the Sultan disposes of it, doesn't need somebody telling him what he has to do. What is decided within the Sublime Gate is law, is order, right? It's an order. It will happen. These provincial armies are very varied, as we've said, and they are, however, composed mostly of this fairly balanced mix of, what you could expect as most armies in this broader areas. A core of heavy cavalry and lots of light cavalry, light infantry. That's mostly it. The Balkanic provinces are tougher in this regard. They're more European-like. They have stronger infantries in a way, but they do not have what, in fact, also the Westerners here in Pike&Shot are developing. Famously enough, also in Eastern Europe, you don't see much of that, even in the major powers. Think about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is one of the greatest powers of this time, and by the 15th century is completely identical in its military to the Western Europe, but when they fully, incorporate Lithuania and extend their boundaries far east, to basically reorganize their army in a way in which they implement, for example, once again, heavy cavalry, the famous winged hussars, but also these swarms of Tatars that are taking it. Well, there is something very similar to that in the Ottoman army. The Ottoman army was an enormous thing. Usually they marched. This was the big empire. There's no other way, even just politically, strategically, for a big empire, but to do things big, right? So it's not the tiny campaign on a just provincial scale that costs a freaking lot of money, and then you have to call contract debts like the Habsburgs did with the Fugger or the Bank of St. George, and eventually taking bit by bit, step by step. The Ottomans are used since the 16th century to march and conquer entire regions, right? At certain point it stops, right? And this is not much a matter of decline in the Ottoman military. there is not specific evidence of that, but it's simply the realization that if the boundaries of the empire are at 600 miles away, and you have to wage a regional scale campaign, well, that costs a freaking lot of money, can make even your power collapse. It's a major turning point. So there are actually great commitments of the empire in this time, major campaigns, especially great naval sea operations, sieges, as actually most were at the time, but in scale that other countries normally didn't see, right? And that's also where the Ottomans are beaten off, started to be beaten in a way. 1529, at the siege of Vienna, the first siege of Vienna, that's the first burning defeat of Suleiman, for example. Think about Malta or just Lepanto, the naval battle, naval engagement. There are many examples of this. There's the Kandia War that bleeds the Ottoman Empire and Venice out, actually, altogether. And that's the picture that we have to start reasoning like. I mean, you are an empire that is huge but has not infinite resources. And on the contrary, being a larger empire actually brings in an attrition that smaller powers normally do not have altogether, because it costs a freaking lot to keep all the thing together, way more than keeping just a single region, a single province. So the idea is that we have an Ottoman Empire that, especially towards the end of this period, is fighting constantly on 4 different fronts. Right? You have the Mediterranean, it's quite hot. You have the Danubian theater. You have Eastern Europe too, and Persia. So what is astonishing, and in many ways we do not ask much about certain empires, like why did these great empires fail? The question of these empires should be, how the hell did they even make it to remain so long, 4 decades fighting at the same time on 4 different fronts? It's something that would exhaust the greatest of them, and it probably did in this very regard. And that point of the alleged declining quality or technological gap is utter bullshit, because first of all, there is no evidence, even by the late 17th century, that the Ottomans bought more than 5% of their, for example, gunpowder needs from abroad. It was mostly from places like Sweden or England. And you know that in order to have a functional artillery, actually at this point the most expensive thing ever is gunpowder. It's not about casting the guns. It's literally the powder that it's difficult to produce in a sense, or at least expensive, and can't be found everywhere in large productions. And this 5% is just something that happened in the last decades of the 17th century, where the Europeans had basically gone in overproduction of weapons and ammo after a 30 years war, and that's basically it. The Ottoman Empire was fully at a 95% reliable on its own artillery production. After the Battle of St. Gotthard on August 1st, 1664, when Montecuccoli seized the Ottoman camp, he looked at the gunpowder he had found, and if Montecuccoli said that, it's true. He stated that Ottoman power was excellent in quality. So here we have pretty, I know that the thing is more complex than this, but altogether, if you want to start even just dialectically making a point of these issues, you understand that the main indicators of these capacities, Ottoman capacities as far firepower technology was concerned, do not show any kind of gap, even at the end of the 17th century, where allegedly, the Ottomans had to be. I mean, look at what just 1683, Vienna 1683 was in terms just of sheer, even their firepower. Look at Ottoman tactics. What the Ottomans in 1683 carry out under the walls of Vienna is, with this mining and bombardment and assaults in sequence, is something actually very similar to what the Stoßtruppen did in World War I. The Janissaries in here also, in terms of tactical philosophy, we could say, they were actually an army on its own, but as we've seen, they relied on firepower. They didn't have much of a stopping capability. There was not much deal of pike, as we've seen. but they were quite aggressive and dynamic. That was the deal of the Ottoman Empire, always showing this confusing dynamism, cynicism that was showed even in the pace of the Janissaries, right? You know, how did they walk? Basically, they stayed in line, then they turned 45 degrees, and then they went they went forward, then turned 9 degrees, then left, then 90 degrees right, and they advanced in this zigzag way that, think, you know, thousands of them all together showing off like that, you know, almost in a scenographical fashion, in a way that you say, but you would say, well, what's the reason of that? The reason of that is just like, you know, wearing, I don't know, all the same uniform. It's psychological. You know, you see an enemy that marches like that in front of you, you say, wow, these guys are about to kill or get killed, and what they can think at with this utmost precision of march and execution is to march like it is zigzag, right? Visually speaking, it might have been actually a spectacle, but terrifying. The Ottomans famously also relied on an important musical tradition that is a bit a broader Muslim legacy. We even made a video on Islamic military music since millennia, actually even before the Muslim era. Let's say it's mostly a Persian-derived thing, and we know of military bands actually employed by the very early Ottoman armies. The Europeans had this stuff too, actually, but in a very different way. I think we even made a video on, I don't know what it was about 13th century trumpeteers in Western warfare, and say the Westerners were much more secularized in their musical employment, or at least Europe had a different one, historically speaking. In the East, especially connected to all the, you know, this large quantities of horsemen, of light troops that had to be all coordinated and so on. This is also a legacy of the steppe, right? The use of tambours, the most modern military musical instruments in all world's armies are actually either, you know, of Islamic origin or Ottoman derivation, historically speaking, because the Europeans start copying the thing exactly in this century. You know that European princes were crazy, especially in Central Europe. In Middle European culture was this true obsession for Ottoman stuff. You know, all the princes, you know, gifted each other with the most beautiful replicas of scimitars, of armor, of lamellar armor, because in fact, if you tour, you know, Central Europe museums and so on, you'll find always in this Schatzkammer this beautiful Ottoman style stuff, because it was the same Europeans that copied them, and they were truly passionate about it. And we realized that the psychological effect that stood behind this, of the swarms of the hordes that obeyed to a single gesture of the Sultan. The Sultan had all this hieratic, you know, he exposed himself quite rarely. He was almost a semi-divine figure. Naturally, it was all a divinization of the, let's say, of the rituals of this, of the value of silence and of music. It was all connected with, in fact, the power, military power, all together with the divine and with the religious, the musical aspects together. It was a very complex thing of military tradition in these Eastern worlds. And the objective was to scare the hell out of this. And just for the fact of imagining this core of a Janissary army, you know, that included everything, heavy cavalry, you know, light cavalry, every type of artillery and so on. It was mostly, you know, the core was this, essentially arquebusiers and eventually musketeers. Also, it seems that, I don't know, the Ottomans didn't use the musket rest. You know, we don't even know exactly. We're not documented. There are not specific sources like we have in the West about the changes in military technologies that are also complicated to a certain, precisely in certain moments in the Western sources. About the Ottomans, we know mostly what the Westerners refer of. And we're surely in here a different way of approaching the enemy. There was psychological, you know, it was meant to scare, to make him freak out, to concentrate on the dash, on the assault, on the aggressiveness. It doesn't seem, for example, that the Janissaries ever deployed in a fully orderly line. Actually, they did, in my opinion. But the fact is that they weren't just shooters. They weren't just, a line of arquebusiers that you can find, I don't know, in Western armies that just had to do that. The Janissary was, in theory, had the privilege still to choose whichever equipment he liked from the sultanial armories. And they were often equipped, yes, with muskets at this point, but also with axes, with scimitars often, even with bows. I mean, they were very flexible troops. And they are found, in fact, in this different role, that not contemplating a combined arm tactic with pikes is necessary to be more ready to engage in hand-to-hand combat itself. If you look even at Ottoman formations and how they fought, essentially they had this great screen of horse archers, right? Even on the march, usually an Ottoman army would be preceded by these swarms of subjected peoples, like mostly Tartars, these semi-nomadic populations with the swarms of light horsemen that all they could do very gladly was razing everything to the ground, pillaging by vocation. And then the bulk followed. They usually had the heavier cavalry on the right, at the same line of height of the infantry line, and in the front they had all these horse archers that had to release this enormous to disrupt the cohesion of the enemy ranks, to soften them up. And the Sultan was in the center, surrounded by the Janissaries that constituted, also with earthworks, entrenchments, and so on, a literal bulwark against the possible attacks. This recalls, the Janissaries could even be described by a certain sense as assault engineers. They were pretty damn skilled in siege warfare as well, not just in storming the fortifications, which they actually carried out fanatically and bravely in their way, but also literally even entrenching on their own, and that's something you can see even, I don't know, if you look at the Battle of Nicopolis, of this, even this increase in field fortifications, right, to cope with the enemy cavalry not having much of stopping infantry on their own, right, but just melee infantry was very important, and it reflected in the broader hierarchy of this army this also capacity to find solutions autonomously to defend the Sultan and so on. Then we cannot fully describe, I think we made actually a bit about Ottoman light cavalry, I think last year, that illustrates the huge amount of subjected peoples that the Ottomans could mobilize and send to war in their armies, right? They didn't come all at once, but you have to imagine literally, a great heterogeneity in all this thing, so much that in fact even the Janissaries represented the only truly standard arm, right? The one that the permanent army, the one that was more easily recognizable. And in all of this, you have to understand naturally that such an extended empire, all great empires, draws constantly an enormous amount of military know-how from its enemies, as much as they do with him. So they fought with an enormous diversity of peoples and polities. Think about the Knights of St. John, the Moors, the Druses, the Mamluks, the Persians, the Abyssinians, Portuguese, Poles, Cossacks, Muscovites, Wallachians, Hungarians, Spanish, imperialists, right? So this is like an enormous school, right? There are specific traditions. We know, especially among the Janissaries, that there was this enormous pride belonging to this esprit de corps that, as we were saying before, eventually, this Janissaries began to become like from an elite, the entire army in many ways. The world changes. Many populations also under the empire are framed much more, at the moment of the first expansion, of course, these were kind of free people, so they had also more to offer in terms of combat capability and so on. So a bit like the Auxiliary and the Roman Empire. At a certain point, they lose their military lifestyle, and over time they become just subjects in a sense. So the Janissaries start to replace that and to become, especially towards the 17th century, to include other forms of other levies, fundamentally, that were not just drawn through the Dutch Sherman, etc., but were also kind of a normal soldier. So that's a bit the trend that happens, to simplify very brutally, but they remained always of very high quality, a very high level, and this was recognized by their enemies that feared them indeed very much. We got lost in the Clausewitz triad, but as you understand, politically speaking, that was how the Ottomans dealt with the thing. Socially speaking, there would be to say that indeed, as we also reminded before, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Near East, North Africa weren't Western Europe. So they didn't have historically, and this could even banally seen between, if you look at the last Byzantine society, were just, there was a very low economical, commercial dynamism, for example, compared to Western Europe. There was a much more, they were all latifundia, essentially, large estates and so on. There was not a dynamic middle class, right? At least something comparable to the West. This was caused by the autocratic rule of Byzantine power that, in that sense, didn't allow much, also for cultural resistance, but also more imminent political problems, much of these autonomies to rise. Constantinople basically had swallowed everything else. Like, the only true city remained from the ancient world was Thessalonica. That also didn't like much Constantinople at all, right? So the Ottomans do not help much in the process. They actually search for, when they conquer Constantinople, they need a bureaucracy, they need people who are skilled in maintaining that state standing, and the Ottomans objectively made of Constantinople a great capital once again, a very powerful one. So mostly you have to look at Greeks, Jews, and sometimes also, as we've seen, also Western refugees, broadly meant, including the Jews. I mean, the Jews were very well treated in the Ottoman Empire, or at least, compared to Western Europe. Definitely, there is this famous story of those Jewish, widows that had inherited this huge fortune in the Netherlands, and Charles V did everything possible to track them, not to flee to Constantinople, but we have evidence, Venetian merchants that converted from Christianity to Judaism to go live in Constantinople. Even we have the actual letters that say to their wives, "Come here, it's fantastic, just convert to Judaism," and their wives that were pious Christians said, "No, we don't want anything to do with that." But just for saying how crossing the borders were in this regard, as we were saying before, also banally, we know of sources that tell us that actually the majority of pirates of privateers in Ottoman service in the Western Mediterranean were Europeans. Yeah, I mean, just 1/3 were Turks. To them, those were rated Christian European short. They were actually Europeans. There is, even as I was saying in the beginning, a huge literature about this. But socially speaking, the point I wanted to make, for the reason of the absence of a Pike-Shot, is that, the reason also why you can have Pike-Shot formations in large masses in the West is because there are middle classes very dynamic, that know the technologies, that there is a market of warfare that is very dynamic, very competitive. In this, there is nothing like that, right? The socio-economical structures are very different, so you can't have properly the basis for that. I mean, it's not that the Swiss invented at some point to enlist 4,000 random guys to make a huge square block of pikemen, without having, people who could even just provide all for the logistics, the equipment, the mentality, etc. That came from a specific area of Europe that, eventually was copied by became virtually identical in all Europe, as far to Moscovia, right? So much that the Russians actually conquered Siberia thanks to Pike-and-Shot tactics under Timofeyevich. And there was the Russian Pizarro under even the so-called the Terrible, but the Ottomans didn't, and probably, as we were saying, from a political point of view, they weren't even interested in creating one, because that would fundamentally, alter this fundamentally oligarchic or aristocratic way of ruling the place. Actually, the Ottomans, in a way, that they had a meritocratic bureaucracy, like all great centralized empires. They had lots of officers that they counted very much on the Christians in their administration, especially as far as it concerned the Christian lands of the Balkans and also some other areas in the Near East. Very famous were the Greek officers who were sent to Romania to control the local government. There are things like this, but this is still elite in a way. And it's civilian. As far as the military is concerned, no thanks. It's better to have the centralized private army of sultan's servants that is freaking amazing and can be afforded thanks to the enormous expense of the empire. And then, thanks to this enormous deterrent power that we have, we sent the provincial armies together with the Janissaries to invade the other lands as the expedition. And it works. It works. I mean, there is nothing that you can't say in this time, the Ottomans, who knows which enormous defeats. So there wasn't properly a great. There weren't great battles, as you know. Even the Battle of St. Gotthard in 1664 came something like 70 years later from the other true field-pitched battle that was the Battle of Geneseries in 1596. Right, and in fact, that was the unique battle of comparable magnitude between the Ottomans and the Christians on European soils from the Battle of St. Gotthard, and that tells you also at a strategical level. Some of you once asked me, but why didn't these guys get it done with? Right? Why wasn't the major battle and decided who could rule over Europe? But how could it even? How could it even been possible? Like, do you think that this was a unique bloc? There were actually two blocs fighting. There were many blocs fighting. They didn't have any interest to send enormous forces to be destroyed at the frontier. Was 600 miles away from the empire, and they would just way more profitably and with an enormous benefit all fight by storming that fortress on another over time. Also, the Ottomans became the usual enemy at a point, right? Sometimes, actually, as we were saying, the Europeans actually hated very much each other more than the Ottomans. The Protestants, famously said that they preferred the Ottoman turban to the papal tiara as much as the Greeks that opened the gates to Constantinople to the Ottomans, and there were fierce competition. I mean, the greatest Ottoman ally was the most Catholic France. What's the deal with that, right? Before Suleiman, for example, at the time of Selim the First, the greatest allies of the empire were actually Hungary, Venice. Those were famously it, right? So there were intermitting reasons, interests. For example, I don't know, the Venetians were and the Ottomans fought basically some of the most devastating wars in the history, on the annals of military history. I mean, look at the siege of Candia. It's easily, probably the truest, greatest siege ever happened in the history of military annals. But the point is that I don't know. They had they had to stop. They had to trade at one point. It costed too much for them to fight against each other. Actually, the Venetians were happy if the Ottomans crushed the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, because the Portuguese had opened the African route and were now taking a lot of assets away from eastern markets that could pass through Venice. As we've seen, there was a fierce competition. The Protestants didn't truly give a damn about the Catholics fighting against the Ottomans. So here, that is the picture, and we have to get used to the fact that it was the new normality to have the Ottomans next door, which was not reassuring at all. By the slightest, but sometimes that translated itself in great moments of stasis when, and we've seen it, especially looking at the strategical situation in the Danubian region before the 1683 campaign, that, I don't know, like the Austrians hated way more the Protestant Hungarians than what they cared about the Turks if these didn't move, actually. So, I don't know, John III Sobieski we have seen also that all the papal diplomacy to actually call it in to help the Habsburgs, that he couldn't care less too. He didn't give a damn, right? And except the fact he understood that if Vienna had fallen, he would have been next. So Jan Sobieski was a great commander, but also, and more importantly, a great political man that had a rare quality of understanding on the long run, the advantages that can come that are more important than the ones at the moment, the momentary ones, and he delivered that freaking amazing victory under the walls of Vienna, and that's the reality of Europe, right? And that's also why France, take France, it's not that the French like the Turks. France basically lent Marseille to the Ottomans at some point. Like the Ottoman Navy at some point stationed in Marseille port and the Ottoman army in Marseille, causing a mess in Marseille because naturally, all the citizens had to flee. It was a mess. But they allowed it to. Why? Because they liked the Turks? Oh, hell no, nobody liked each other at the time. But simply they needed that because they said, for now, for us, France, it's better to fight against the Habsburgs than the day that they will be crushed by the Ottomans, we'll take the lead in Germany, in Italy, wherever that will happen to be fought, and that fundamentally it, right? There isn't much else. Concerning also the fall of Vienna in 1683, if that had happened, it's possible that really the Ottomans would have pushed further. Not that it would have conquered would wall Europe, that is unrealistic, but at least Germany would have been a pillaging, if not a conquest area. And that, think about the different, what it would have meant for the history of mankind, just to think like that. Think about all the relations think holding the Alpine passes that would have launched offenses in Italy and counter, basically. So, just think about the importance of these countries in Europe and in modern contemporary era, and what the whole world would have been today if these places had a different history of that kind. And some had, because what happened in the Balkans actually exemplifies what happened to certain realities. Hungary was wiped out, or at least even in there maintained an autonomy under the Ottomans, but it was split, naturally nothing like the old kingdom fundamentally had been before. We find this kind of considerations that could not leave indifferent and simply make the simple story of the two clash of civilizations, and these were intertwined at so many levels that it's not even a valid dialectical method framing the question. What else could we say about Ottoman warfare? A lot of things, naturally, but let's say the difference that the Ottoman military made also as a model for the Europeans. This is quite important. Here, especially in the 16th century, we have in the Ottoman army large regular forces that are paid, disciplined, they live in barracks, and they enjoy fundamentally also what could be defined as modern benefits, such as pensions, paid leave. European forces didn't have something like this, right? They were just setting themselves in motion to create this permanent armies that could also be maintained, in force for longer times, having, the various communities accepting the fact, as we were saying before, this is not a matter much of, necessarily a weakness, because this fragmentation helped to boost a competition and an improvement within the same Europe, which is something that the Ottomans didn't have, but also that didn't seem to have dramatically, create problems to them, right? On the long time, as we've seen, the quality, given their basis, given what their society was, their politics were good. They function, right? The Western accounts say that the Ottomans had all the resources of a mighty empire: strength unimpaired, experience and practice in fighting, a veteran soldiery, right? These being permanent troops, they had specifically also they had seen it, right? What does it mean, a people better than other fighting? The fact that they are inherently more or less warlike? No, humans are all alike. What makes the difference is freaking experience. The fact that you could have officers that had served, in North Africa as much as in Crimea, or in Serbia, or in Persia. That is something that an experience that you really need, that you really want. Von Clausewitz is quite open about this. That's a necessity. You must send troops. In fact, the Europeans did send troops. There were advisors, as we've seen also in the Ottoman Empire, not just as turncoats, right? There were specific, lots of also a great variety of people: magnates, spies, agents, ambassadors of different kinds that, regularly also lived in Constantinople as official representatives, that knew what the place was, that studied it, that came back with information, with what import, with that fascination that we have seen before, right? Once again, we're going at a bit to bit, but I didn't conclude with the Clausewitzian triad. The third element that we have to look at, that is strictly the military one, or better, the tactical, strategical side of the story. That is, why didn't the Ottomans develop a true Pike&Shot system? Well, the reason being also in here probably the nature of the enemies and the terrains where they fought. This is very important. First of all, as we've seen, as far as combined tactics were involved, the Ottomans and the Westerners fundamentally counterbalance each other. One weakness of the other was the strength of the other, and vice versa. However, that exactly, if we switch towards the east and the center of the empire, we realize that the Westerners were just one of the enemies, right? So fighting in places like even the Balkans, certain areas of Central, is tough. Having Pike&Shot armies requires also pitched battles, major engagements. We've seen that, strategically speaking, there wasn't much of a reason to do it unless a big siege, like in fact the ones at Vienna were, they were stopped twice. But if you have to fight against the Persians, Pike&Shot does work. We've seen at Calderon that just firearms are, the orderly fire of the Janissary line against the Persians makes a hell of an impression, and so much that it's from that point onwards that actually Safavid Persia will start to introduce more structurally, systematically firearms, right, to counter this. But generally speaking, these are vast terrains that require also mobility, difficult grounds, also difficult weather. The flexibility inherent to light cavalry, light infantry, and also a more flexible body of this melee/firearm troops. It's very important. It's very useful for the various theaters you're going to be engaged, right? After all, also, it's not that they have, as we've seen, to be necessarily Turkish troops. I mean, if you see, I don't know, the Moldovans or the Valachians or other peoples that were within the Ottoman Empire, well, yeah, I mean, they were more Eastern in nature. They weren't literally fully westernized in warfare. You know that in Eastern Europe you have a broader importance of cavalry. They're much similar. You know, there are range actions of this ethnic element also in 18th century, especially cavalry warfare. But it existed since the 17th or even the 16th actually. So those are also communities that live next door to the enemies you're fighting against. So technically, you know, that they are already used to fight them effectively in a way. So if you use those troops, that will fundamentally do, right? What's the problem? So there is not this dramatic difference. It doesn't make this great asymmetry not to have Pike&Shot from one side, and that's the technologistic prejudice that we have to abandon. Because the same Europeans looked astonished at the Ottoman capabilities on other grounds, right? They were terrified by these light cavalrymen, by artillery, by the Janissaries, as even assault infantry. You know, this siege warfare, in which the Ottomans had this great experience and capabilities, mostly the logistical capabilities. As much as the Turks feared legitimately Pike&Shot tactics, the resilience of Western infantries, and even actually of heavy cavalry, because telling the truth, the Westerners at this point had still from the Middle Ages still this actually important heavy cavalry element that as an elite the East had never topped, right, since the times of the Crusades. I mean, it is pretty evident with the idea of, but it is actually still largely feudal Europe at the end of the day. They don't think that cavalry ends with it. You know, look at what happened in France, right? It's not if they seek for infantry, heavy cavalry disappears. So that's also a thing, but that's also, for example, a matter of proportions, right? How much you can have, you know, in terms of quantity, quality, what logistical problems does it pose? There are so many factors that counterbalance each other that, once again, they both knew their business, and there is not an intrinsic inferiority or superiority of these models on the long run. There is no proof that the Ottomans were declining compared to the Europeans in terms of tactical effectiveness. There is not, right? There is much more than that. And generally speaking, when you fight, that's the least. You know, we're essentially talking about, if you're talking about differences in arms, you're at the end of the day you're making it. I mean, either there is a major structural difference in the interaction of the three main arms. And this doesn't seem to be the case, because I've seen the word counterbalance. If you're talking about small unit tactics, it's even worse, because you know, given the variety of troops and just the fact that they are smaller in scale, it makes even less sense, right? It's even virtually less insignificant at some point. So yes, this is my military explanation. It wasn't much need to create something parallel to Western warfare, because surprise, surprise, different societies create different military systems, and they know their deal. Their politics know its deal. Creates things that do work, and they did work. So that's basically it. Another important aspect, naturally, of Ottoman warfare, as it was important also naturally in Christian Europe, was the religious one, right? This stiffening religious enthusiasm that was particularly evident, as you understand, in the case of the Janissaries, but it still was alive among the lots of many Muslims and Christians that regularly served in the Ottoman armies. I mean, Christians were usually employed. 1 out of 10 normally in the Ottoman army was of the various farm plots, right? You know, land possessions, just like the other subjects, famously enough. I mean, what's the deal? And that is an aspect that naturally was ideologically reinvigorated, especially by politics. You know that even Suleiman the Magnificent had a turban that, you know, put together several crowns. It was just like a large papal tiara, right? And Francis I, you know, had also this crown. They all copied each other. So even the ambiguities from a political point of view were often very serious at the limit of heresy, right? Especially, Ottoman sultans, given the religious communities of the ulama, were often heterodox in their political propaganda, because they wanted naturally to seek consensus also among the Christians, as they regularly did on international arena or within the same empire. So the ulama didn't quite like that. In fact, by the 18th century, that there will be also the responsibles for the failed westernization of Turkey. That it's another major European, historical matter. The fact that Turkey during the 18th century could fully westernize, and it didn't, and this changed also history forever in many ways. But the greatest religious ideology was mostly at these high levels, right? As far as the esprit de corps and military motivation of the troops, etc. Well, these could be, it's loot. Let's be honest. I mean, the Janissaries and their servants' geese were fundamentally also meant to be rewarded with loot, with this prestigious element that, since the times of the steppes in the Turkic culture, was the great prize, right? And that's also before. I mean, the Janissaries were instituted by the late 14th century, so they're actually an ancient institution. But before that, all these Muslim powers, especially in Anatolia, there was a bit the rebellious / heterodox scum of Islam, considered like that, because technically these mountainous areas were during the Middle Ages, all the heretics, the fanatics, the most warlike also fringes of the various subjects that were confined by the Sunni orthodoxy. So it doesn't matter that actually these were Sunni as well, obviously enough, but they truly, there was this idea of the Ghazi, of this that in Anatolia basically meant just to be a mordir, right, a looter and so on. And these were actually very they were at the beginning the basis of this sultanial armies, right? Just in terms of numbers, these were just mordirs. You could find like brigands, because let's be honest, the world was about brigandry at the time, right? Before modern states, what is the nature of political realities of culture? There's a bunch of criminals, right? Without a state, even in Europe, what do you think a feudal lord is? It's just a criminal that seeks for tribal protection. It's a mobster. These were specifically mordirs that were hired, and just to loot and pillage. You could find them anywhere. Like if you look even at the history of the Balkans, of Hungary, all these swarms coming from the steppes of Kumans, all these other refugees from the Mongol invasions, there were always plenty of. The Ottomans employed them regularly also later, also because they increased their capacity of intervening in this broader Pontic area of the Black Sea, of the Ukraine, of this corridor that goes down around the Carpathians, through Wallachia and so on, where all these nomads crossed. And at the beginning, these Ghazis were, let's say, warriors of the faith that would fight. They weren't even dramatically equipped. They were just a rabble, right? But then they wanted their loot. But it was over. At the end of the expedition, you couldn't say, okay, you are my subjects now, you remain to be a permanent army. They would say, screw you. So that's why the Ottomans created Janissaries, because those were their own thing. Like, they owned them, right? They were their possession. But they would reward them more and better than the others, more regularly, and with a structure, as we've seen with pensions, with land, and so on. And also the whole Islamic deal here was concerned, because if you look, there are interesting studies that compare, but by the 16th century, the Moroccan powers with the Ottoman one. So you see, in the first one, still this tribal reality, however, still loot and pillaging was very important. It was a way to assert the material power. Well, the Ottomans maintained that by culture, by tradition. So they transformed this empire in this great master, this great invader that raids and deposits and treasures resources that eventually distributes to his faithful, loyal servants. And that's how you maintain, definitely, even if things went differently. I mean, they now had a state in Constantinople, a true state, true bureaucracy, and whatever. So that's what made the thing done. But the resources to do that were naturally based primarily on their military capacity and their deterrent force to exact tributes and to send an army there to slaughter everybody if they didn't like it. And so that is the nature of an empire, and couldn't be any different, right? But through these things, we also have civilization on the long run, and definitely the Ottoman Empire did contribute to this. Even just by osmosis, by contrast, also by inclusion, all these Western turncoats and specialists, advisors, and spies, were all called gladly in, because they always actually maintained, as we've seen even before, the technological standards at the level they had to be. They knew about their enemies. So that's, I think, what we should think the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman warfare, mostly like, right? To make this great effort of abstraction and saying, okay, I don't reason now like either a Westerner or a Turk. I see there are Turkish followers among on Schwerpunkt and so on. Yeah. But to look at the thing from the above and say, wow, but these two civilizations actually, and you can't hardly see where one begins and the other stops, because they were evenly intersected and overlapping. You know what? They did something that, in the history of the world, for all the most devastatingly impacting dynamics that all this clash with the Turks entailed, changed the entire history of mankind, and nobody can deny that. And therefore, whatever this thing is happening, there is a lot of room for studying, a lot of room for improving actually the knowledge of these realities. As far as I know, what's the sad story of that is that in the West, fortunately, actually, we study our history pretty damn well in universities, right? Not in schools, unfortunately. In other countries, still, this is not true. Like, I don't know of a major Turkish historiography. I don't know of a usually, there is surely a good work that is starting, even and especially, and this is very important, starting from the Balkanic countries, from these countries that also surely founded their national unity with the independent struggles against the Ottomans, and that unfortunately also were engulfed during the history of the 20th century in some of the most terrifying realities in Europe. But think about genocide, that have I know a few of them. They have a dialogue with a very interesting one with Turkish historiography. There is a great cooperation. And there is definitely, for those countries, the acknowledgement that is way deeper, like necessarily deeper than, I don't know, what a Western European could say, that is just, we're risked to be invaded, but we made it to remain out. But those were within the Ottoman Empire. So it's part of their history, it's part of their of what they lived through, and naturally, we are acknowledging a lot of things that mostly we already know. It's not that if those countries or Turkey do not study that reality, we cannot know about that reality, because unfortunately, sources are limited. As we're saying at the beginning, these countries didn't have a historiography like there was in the West at the time. They didn't produce the same amount of sources of documents. It wasn't very different, right? Just because of political culture, as we've seen, as socioeconomical differences and so on. So they're more difficult to document. But I talked with specialists. I have a professor in my department studies Romanian history during the 15th, 16th century. Well, he looked into that academic reality and realize that yeah, I mean, we have a fairly good idea of what happened there, generally speaking, but there is so much to dig, right? So much to dig yet. So that there is still a lot of part of properly European history, because that's Europe, guys, that we do not know. And partly, and the sad thing of this is that definitely popular culture, nobody gives a damn, or at least it's just this obsessive thing of the counterposition between who won, who lost, like this despicable way of studying history as if we were playing a football game, right? Who won more battles or less battles and all this bullshit, and not building any kind of real structured strategic education of sort, let alone civic literacy or democratic culture. And that's another problem, right? But these are not things we can't skip anymore, right? That time is over, and we have an enormous interest in doing it, because the moment in which we all realize that our stories are so intertwined, we will have much less problems to get along, right? And politics is not an easy ground. International one especially, it's evidently pretty messed up. But if you look at the geography of the Ottoman Empire and all that happened in many countries that were covered eventually by either the Ottoman conquest, Ottoman domination, Ottoman collapse, emancipation, independence, whatever you want to call it, there are, they are the countries from which, some of the most important problems arose from, in the sense that, either they are either economical, political, there have been wars, genocide. I mean, those are the areas that we need to take care of as far as, also our national and international interests are concerned. Right, and that cannot be understood if you do not know what happened in those countries in the past. As ugly as also as interesting or even positive can be, that's where we need to have a way more objective take, because otherwise we will not be in the condition of forgiving ourselves when far worse things will happen at some point. And I do want to think that actually there is an improvement. Like I generally see that there is a growth. Ideas travel. People are not narrow-minded like before, but they need to be more educated. They need to know more, right, compared to previous times. There are great achievements that we cannot sleep on. We have to capitalize upon. It is way more important. Okay, we could say more, because now I'll check actually how many videos I made about Ottoman warfare, because I created it, or it was Ottoman history. I think it was Ottoman history. Now I'll take it a look, because it's a consistent number. So if you're interested, now this today was just a broader reflection. Let me Ottoman. Okay, so 13 videos. My God, I thought it were less. 13. So this is the 14th. Yes, because we made a lot of videos about from this year about Prince again and the So we made at this point a video on the Dardanelles guns. That is the great Turkish bomber. Then appearance of the Janissaries, the Westerners and the fall of Constantinople, the West and the erosion of the Roman Empire, Europe and the fall of Constantinople. Well, we covered these topics, are really interesting. They are mostly about what the Westerners did when the Ottomans were rising, or better, how the Westerners led or even actively produced the Ottoman rise. And that's a chapter that is also not very much, doesn't sound, very, popular, at least in the West, but probably not even in Turkey they think like that. Then the rise of the Ottomans, inclusive character of the Ottoman Empire. This one caused a lot of trouble, because to me inclusive it means etymologically, the fact that you bring a lot of these foreigners in, and that's as we've seen with the Greeks, the Jews, the various foreign, the Ottoman administration, and so on. But inclusive, unfortunately, another words in English took another semantic meaning, that skips etymology, which to me is a utterly barbaric thing. Inclusive means literally you bring in, so you can even bring in with force. Even the deaf Shirma can be inclusive, right? It doesn't mean to be tolerant and nice and pink and all this stuff. No, it can be brutal, as the deaf Shirma in fact it was, but it is indeed true that all great empires, just like the Ottoman one, did necessarily use cooptation to rule, right? I could change the title, but whatever. Then we made this thing, Ottoman light cavalry and auxiliaries. In this period, Ottoman rise and empire between west and east. That's interesting. The Kapu Kalki, the Sultan's own army, which was something even different from the Janissaries, but also pretty damn efficient. And this is for the first 2 centuries, the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. And we made Ottoman privateering in the Christian conquest of Tunis, Ottoman artillery, and Vienna 1683, Marcia alla Turca, right? These are interesting because they, I think for now, they give a good insight of the broader outline. And, you know, I've never studied Ottoman history thoroughly, right? The idea broadly meant is that these are not usually the kind of stories where at least in the West we were used to study or to start to be brought up with, right? It's always the outer side. It's always the other. It's always an alien thing in a way. But it's when you start doing it that you really understand actually how useful actually it is to know them. So I will keep doing that, and there is really a lot of topics we have to cover, and I think at least this will do for now, and naturally we'll go way more in detail, especially about the Ottoman military, because that's essentially what we have to talk about, or at least a bit of Ottoman military history proper in certain cases, international, political, strategical, diplomatic issues, right? And during especially the 16th to 17th century. So this is it, and for now I will stop it here. Just one thing that at this moment I don't have much time to answer comments because I'm a bit in a broader shortage of time, and also it's become difficult literally because of the number of them. So I don't say any more things like, if there is something that doesn't work, ask me a question. But I presume you can find answers on your own. That is not to simply unload my responsibility for what I say, which I take willingly, but and unavoidably. But I must say everything I say in these videos is deriving from a set of information that you cannot get to, right? I don't say that you can invent them or you can simply understand it if you've never read them once. You just heard it for the first time. But the point is that these perspectives are very well known historiographically speaking. They are not ideological, which is also what I tend to take even merit from, because I presume most of you follow me because you realize that I do not give a damn about saying these were the good or the bad guys. We cut solely on the national basis, whatever. Things are always very, very complex. But specifically, I care for presenting, as far as I can, an objective picture of the wall, and that's something which I feel the need to point out because I don't see it much around, right? I'm always bothered by superficiality, including my own. So in here I try to make, perhaps not my best because I take it as a talk after all, but I always make an effort to be understood in the in the essence of what can be drawn from the historical research, the historical reality as we can get it, right? And especially, and I promise, maybe even recently, I will make these videos about the strategy of the Ottoman Empire and the alleged technological backwardness of it, that as we've seen, it's absurd, because frankly, I don't say it because I care about more than less about which perspective is, but you know that Schwerpunkt is mostly a Western-based video, and it's exactly from a Western standpoint that I say it is important to say that we fought for centuries against something that was freaking amazing, right? And we need to point that out, because that gave to us also something that probably what would have been Europe without the Ottoman wars. This is how people try to flip the thing. Instead of bitching about the fact that they, this terrible Turks that invaded us, what a terrible thing, it was the empire of evil, we were the good ones, the good guys, right? If you instead started realizing that what we are now is thanks to that freaking nightmare that, however, came from the fact that the people from the other side were a civilization, just like us, and not a bunch of barbarians or monsters, right? As we have said for the Achaemenids, for all those that in the 19th century had to stereotype as a bunch of wild beasts and instead were freaking civilizations. Well, those times are over, right? There is no Western value in demonizing these realities or whatever you want to do, because also within Europeans, it's not that we are kind of acting any better, telling the truth. I mean, the ways we address towards each other's nationality is utterly disgusting. At this point, it seems to have come back in the 1930s. But aside from this, I would like to say that where we can draw strength from altogether is exactly from this knowledge, is exactly from this realization. It's like you become a different person in the moment in which you realize how tremendous this thing was, and how tremendous, because not how barbaric, but for how clever and advanced it was, because otherwise there would be no pride even, right? But well, this is broad naturally, and we have to address it maybe also in other terms, and not just for, well, now we're talking about the Ottomans, but generally speaking, this could be done as, I don't know, we talked about, this gets fascinating, but with something that is all Western, right? I presume most of you follow me because of the Roman and German history videos, right? Because that's the dichotomy, everybody has an opinion, and it's true healing these wounds, is true building something on, that historical, that quite harsh historical realization that we can become ever stronger. And to me, this is the philosophy I use on Schwerpunkt, and that I've seen a true benefit deriving from, like, people becoming better, making a difference in this world, for real, not talking, right? So that's where I finish, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.